You've been made aware with our two guests for our morning panel. There's a lot of really fascinating things happening in Canada in the quantum technology arena. Fascinating things that perhaps as Americans, many of you were not aware of and are now clued in with, and things of which as Canadians, you can take great particular pride that this direction has been taken and that these kind of work is underway in really innovative and I think really ways that are worthy of emulation here south of the border. But I also want to make it clear, and I think what you're going to find out in the next half hour or so is that what's happening here in quantum is one part of a larger story, which is the degree to which Canada has really focused its resources and its talent and its strategies on the entire high-tech terrain, which includes not just quantum, but includes artificial intelligence, it includes 5G and advanced wireless. There's a wide range of advanced technologies here where Canada has been taking the lead in thinking about and strategizing and targeting resources in ways that can be, I think, very impressive, and that again are ways in which we can, I think, glean some ideas and some directions with that. So while the resources are, from a U.S. perspective, fairly small in terms of the thinking about, in terms of the focus, the effort is very large. Now, one of the guests that I wanted to have here as part of the discussion about where quantum technology now fits into a broader way of thinking about advanced technology and how to partner public and private resources together was Iain Stewart. He's director of the president of the National Research Council of Canada. And it was a great gratification for me and pleasure to know that he was going to be able to join us for today and to give us a discussion of just that kind of issues. Now, if you don't know Iain Stewart, he's had a number of leadership roles across the Canadian public sector. He's been Assistant Deputy Minister at Strategic Policy Sector, Director General of the Science and Innovation Sector, and Director of Consumer Industries in the Industry Sector. He's also been Assistant Vice President for Research at his alma mater, Dalhousie University. Since 2015, however, Mr. Stewart has served first as Associate Secretary of the Treasury Board of Canada, and now, as I mentioned, as President of the National Research Council of Canada. It's an honor and privilege to be able to introduce to you Mr. Iain Stewart. Thanks, Iain.
Thank you very much.
Move out of your way.
This way?
Set up.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Herman. Thank you very much for that. I was very happy to learn I'm not the only person still using a BlackBerry. 15 years into this relationship, it remains one of my closest companions, so I'm glad to hear others also still have it. It's getting very hard, though, to continue. I should say, first of all, you have a National Research Council, and it's completely unlike our National Research Council. I think ours is older, so I think we have name rights. I'm certainly able to contest that anyway. We run a series of labs. We have 22 labs across the country in Canada, and they cover a broad range of discipline areas. We also run Canada's primary funding program for technology startups. We'll deal with about 7,000 companies a year. We fund them, we advise them, and they grow on to do other things. They're part of an ecosystem, which I'm going to come back to, around growing startup companies, technology-based startup companies. Now, what I was asked to speak to today was a little bit of a complicated slice, but now I get why it's relevant and useful. I've been asked to talk about how the government supports advanced science and technology I was asked also to touch on our recent initiative around superclusters, which is a government program, and in particular drill down on quantum and AI, how we've been supporting them. So the idea is to kind of look over our shoulders and see what in effect has been our playbook. How have we arrived at the point where we're able to have a discussion like we are today, in which we're discussed as a quantum leader? I think in the discussion, hopefully, I'll be able to note a few things of interest. And for myself, I didn't really realize until I started preparing my thoughts for this discussion today. One of which is that AI and quantum are actually changing normal behavior in Canada's innovation system. Something new is happening, something that I almost should have had a bit of my presentation touch on. Listening to the conversation this morning, I think it would have been good to start looking at Canada's innovation system and the US innovation system. They're actually quite different. For those of you who aren't students of science and technology policy, in this country, I think around 76% of all of the R&D spending is in the private sector. In Canada, it would be barely above 50%. In Canada, the largest single player as a community in our science R&D spending are universities. We have probably 15 world-class universities, certainly 5 that are among the top universities in the world, and they are the locus of where much of the advancement of ideas are occurring and the production of high-end talent. Universities, of course, are immensely important here in this country as well, but it's not quite the same level of importance they have in Canada. Instead here, obviously, technology-based, innovation-based multinational corporations play an immense role. We all know them. We all deal with them. Many of them, of course, in fact, almost all of them are present in Canada as well, whether just from a sales perspective or from an R&D or from a production perspective. So in Canada, you have large universities, you have multinationals that are based in innovation. They often tend to be not the headquarters operation. And you see a long-standing flow in Canada of our best and brightest from Canada into this market. We provide a lot of talent into the US. Sometimes that's a problem. Many times it's a blessing. The point, though, is that we're very interconnected in ways that are subtle, complex, broad, and range across all aspects of what we're talking about here today. You can think about social networks, research networks, business networks. You think about programs like DARPA. There are Canadians that are part of DARPA programs. You think about all of your universities. You have significant numbers of Canadian students. And sometimes it gets to be a problem. The University of Waterloo is one of our great producers of digital skill. And some years, most of the classes head south here and form a significant part of your technology Silicon Valley experience. So that's kind of context to bear in mind. We're deeply integrated. It's subtle. It's complex. It's multifaceted. To start off kind of with innovation policy more formally, Canada is also very federal. We have strong provincial governments. Provincial governments and federal governments share the jurisdiction around education, around the economy, and therefore innovation kind of falls in between the two. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec have well-developed systems and policies around supporting innovation. So do others, but as the provinces get smaller, the level of investment and sophistication sometimes can diminish, but all provincial governments, I believe, are vested in innovation as a topic. At the federal level in 2016, our minister, Navdeep Bains, put out our Innovation and Skills Plan. It's a complex graphic I took from one of the slides from the time that it was being released. I think the thing that I would underline is that investments in science, basic, sustained investments in science, are key in the Canadian approach to science and innovation. I think you would say the same thing here, because we see, in our case, the university system as the root of the production of talent and ideas that flow out on their legs as they graduate or through collaborations by professors and students out into wider civil society where they have applications, whether it's products, new therapies in hospitals, whatever form it takes, better environmental management. We also invest heavily in skills and education. If you're a fan of OECD league tables, you'll know that Canada is one of the highest educated populations in the OECD. We're usually 6th, 7th, 8th for the highest proportion of people with graduate degrees or with post-secondary education degrees. However, another thing that you would learn if you were a student of league tables from the OECD is that we tend to lag on the industrial innovation side. I'll come back to that in a bit. So, looking at this innovation and skills plan, I was asked to do a drill down in 2 areas relevant for today. I'm going to start with AI and spend a couple of minutes on it in order to then spend more time on quantum. So, starting with AI, I think first of all we need to underline the importance of individuals and the impact that they can have. I'll come back to the importance that Mike has had in our innovation system around quantum. Just to note, Jeffrey Hinton in the center, Yoshio Bengio in the University of Montreal to your left, and Richard Sutton at University of Alberta in Edmonton are all important thought leaders in the domain of AI, and in a way, ecosystems kind of hang off them, if I can be so bold. However, building an ecosystem takes time and has long roots. This is a classic example of something that appears to have happened suddenly that in fact has been slowly built up over the years. And going back to the important role of individuals, there was an individual in 1982 who created the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR, which was somewhat modeled after yours at Princeton, but not quite. It didn't involve residencies, it involved networks. And the idea was that we would create networks that connected up leading researchers in Canada with the leading researchers internationally. We would bring them together regularly around a shared program of research. And in this case, CIFAR in both of these areas of technology has played a foundational role. CIFAR had its first program on an AI in 1983. The second thing that's important to underline is that sustained investment in science. Our granting councils, which are like your research funding entities as well, have been putting sustained money into AI going back over decades. I think if you looked at just the past 5 years, they put $90 million into bottom-up, professor-driven exploratory research. And then the government has made a series of targeted investments. 2 budgets ago, the government directed $125 million solely for the purpose of creating scale and building centers around which activity could adhere. 3 were created, Mila, so back to Yoshua Bengio in Montreal, Jeffrey Hinton and the Vector Institute in Toronto, and Amy in Edmonton around Richard Sutton. These 3 centers have been networked, and CIFAR is acting as a secretariat, trying to create more professors, more students, more networking, more connectivity, and trying to push the 3 research centers to have touch with the companies in their ecosystem. So what does that ecosystem look like today? Over time, the supply of ideas and talent and money starts to encourage the formation of technology-based startups and then SMEs, and hopefully over time, larger companies. At this time, based on a graphic, this is by Jean-François Gagné. Jean-François is the CEO of Element AI. Element AI is a quite successful startup, now SME, based in Montreal. So I'm shamelessly stealing his graphic because it's the kind of graphic that gives you a sense of what's going on in those communities. And you can see the Montreal, Toronto, Edmonton, less so, communities developing. Vancouver, of course, is a favorite location for US-based companies to set up alternate shops in our immigration system because it's easy to bring in talent to Canada. And so we've had burgeoning ecosystems. Waterloo's there. Waterloo, as was mentioned earlier, is actually a small city. It's actually, there's several people here from Waterloo, so they know the population, but I'm going to say it's north of 200,000, but not more than that. Oh my God, it's 500,000. What an insult. I'm so sorry. So Waterloo, nonetheless, is 500,000 people, and Greater Toronto area would be how many? 5, 6 million. So you get a sense of the impact Waterloo has. It's kind of like a pure play on technology as a kind of cultural unit. There's a lot of unity around the importance of science, innovation, technology. You heard anecdotes about people going to the public lectures. Think about what that reflects by way of the commitment of that jurisdiction in this regard. So through our kind of normal approach through the key thought leaders, through the granting councils, through bottom-up research, through the environments we build around SMEs and startups, we've gotten to this juncture. Now, normally this is where in Canada things begin to stall. Normally this is where our leadership in science, which you can look in regenerative medicine, you can look in many domains, in fact, over the past decades, we reach a point where we run out of trajectory and we begin to stall. And therefore, the government turned its mind to how do we pull on that ecosystem? How do we leverage up on what we've obtained so far? That brings me to the supercluster program, which was intended for exactly this purpose. What is a supercluster? A supercluster is a business-led consortia. It's a business-led consortia for a significant part of GDP that's going to pull on technology in order to improve its competitive position over time. So this map, in which I've kind of grayed out all except for the one I want to talk about the most, represents the winners of an extensive national competitive process. 50 initial entrants entered the race for about 200 million Canadian of subsidy, of money that they in turn would be able to disperse through fair, open, competitive processes, transparently, auditable, to a community of people around that topic area. Of those 50, 9 were shortlisted, and then of the 9 shortlisted, 5 were selected. I think these slides will be made available so people can have the detail. Dr. Herman, I believe? Yeah, okay, good. So, perfect, then good. So for those who can't read the parts I've grayed out, my apologies, but they will be available to you. The obvious one, the flag, is Scale AI. Scale AI is solely focused on applying artificial intelligence into supply chains. A few of the other superclusters also officially talk about the use of AI in specific instances for their supercluster. The digital technologies one in British Columbia on the West Coast has a theme around the use of AI. But I think all of them will end up drawing on it because it's a technology whose time is burgeoning, and also because I know a lot of the SMEs inside each of them, and a number of them are AI providers. The protein industries supercluster in the prairies, which is a lot about moving massive volumes of grains and pulses and so on, already involves a number of Canada's AI startups. Advanced manufacturing, which some of us in the room have been very involved in, also has its eyes on the application of AI. Even the ocean supercluster, which is offshore energy, marine biology, and marine energy thematics, involves AI. So we're going to see a lot of funding from these industry-led consortia being directed at pulling on that ecosystem that I was showing you on the previous slide. This is a drill down on Scale AI. There's 110 participants. I threw a few of the logos on the slide here. You'll recognize Bombardier, obviously Canada's largest aerospace manufacturer, but also banks, the Royal Bank of Canada, a very large bank, and then of course Cisco and Intel, and so it goes. US companies, very active in Canada. In the case of Cisco, 700 researchers in my backyard in Ottawa, a lot of presence there and deeply inside these industrial clusters. So if you don't know about the superclusters, American firms do, and they're active participants in all 5 of them. I mentioned they're business-led. I think that's really important. They're making the choices about what they're going to fund and support. They had to leverage money. So they will get on average 200 million each. It varies actually based on their specific proposal. In order to win the contest, they had to leverage money up. If you think about the manufacturing one, I think by the time that they had finished writing their proposal, they were seeking 200 million and they had raised $700 million of private sector investment. So when you see the number on the page saying they're expecting 16.5 billion of GDP impact, bear in mind that each one of these superclusters has leveraged the smallest 400 million and the largest 800 million of private sector financial commitments into that supercluster industrial consortia. So in a nutshell, that's kind of an AI. Here's what happened on the AI side. Key things to think about: the role of research and think tank institutes very early on in the early 80s, identifying this as an area important to us. The steady and permissive exploratory bottom-up funding of individual researchers pursuing the opportunities that face them. Ray was very articulate about the process of trying to find your way through to a solution in an area that you're in. You take a step left, you take a step right, you go up, you go down, you pursue, you don't know where you're going. An ample supply of basic bottom-up research is required, but then significant investments are required to achieve scale, and those begin to build connectivity. So on to quantum. I'm not going to go through what's been well covered this morning about the breadth of what the opportunity provides. I will pick up, Mike showed the cover of The Economist magazine, so I'm showing the bubble graphic inside. It's shorthand. I don't know that it was the most scientific process of arriving at these numbers that was ever taken, but for the purpose of illustration, it gives a relative sense of expenditure at that time, which was 2015, and gives you a sense that Canada is at 1/3 of United States spend, according to this graphic. I would say in the annals of Canadian history, where we had 1/3 of something the US had, is notable. Normally we have a 10-to-1 rule. If we're doing 1, there's 10 south of the border. If we're doing something big, it's 1/10 of what's happening south of the border. For this moment in 2015, it was only 1/3. So I'm going to feel good about that. In the 2013 to 2018 period, we produced about 8,000 papers, had an average relative citation of 1.7 for those of you who are bibliometric adherents, which meant they were relatively high impact papers, and there were a lot of them in an area that was new. And that comes to talking about leadership in a kind of statistical way. So how did we get there? Well, like on AI, it started out with research networks, again CFAR, again in the 80s, launching its first program in 1987, and then following up with a subsequent program. Again, strong, pervasive supply of basic research funding at Canadian universities predominantly. And then thirdly, strategic investments. The interesting thing here, as I was listening to this morning's proceedings, and I was thinking about in AI, the role the supercluster is supposed to play, I kind of thought maybe I could cartoon Mike as the quantum supercluster in his own right. So instead of being an industry consortia, we've had him. And he doesn't talk about the scale of commitment that he has made financially. It is a very substantial amount of commitment that he's made over time. So in the strategic targeted investments, you have an ecosystem that a visionary business entrepreneur put together with his colleagues, some of whom are here in the room, sweat and toil, over a substantial amount of time, with a guiding intelligence who had a plan about what he wanted to achieve. So in the landscape of strategic investments, I think we have to recognize the role that Mike has played in that regard. Other entrepreneurs have also played interesting roles. D-Wave remains a very interesting firm, also going back some time now, also not an overnight thing. So you can see the ramp up in basic, steady, bottom-up funding available to the Canadian research community. And then we come to a very busy slide in which you begin to see some of the state-driven strategic investments. There's a program called the Canada First Research Fund, which will provide up to $100 million for a team of researchers at a given university. It's not a network, it's a group. It's building capacity on a campus. That's on the far right-hand side. In the case of quantum, there are 3 winners. $76 million to Waterloo for David Corey, for quantum computers, sensing, and communications. $33 million for the University of Sherbrooke, for Alexandre Blais, for quantum applications, IT, manufacturing, and health. $66.5 million for UBC, for quantum materials, for Andrea Damicelli. These are massive awards for an individual lab in the Canadian context. Now, again, you have to scale everything up by 10. I'm sure that they're not that big here, but nonetheless, they're notable amounts of money. Behind an individual researcher-led team that shares somebody's vision around what they want to do. In the middle, you'll see Canada Research Excellence Chairs. Each of these chairs receive up to $10 million for themselves and for their lab, and therefore the associates and students who work with them. Robert Boyd on optics, David Corey again, so he's doubled down on info processing, Bertrand Rouillet, and Alan Asperu-Guzik, who just recently came to Canada as a result of one of these chairs, in this case called the Canada 150 chair, celebrating our anniversary in Canada. So it's an extraordinary range of public investments targeted around the visual of leading researchers and their teams based on what they think they can achieve in this space. So it's scaling up. Now, on the far left-hand side, as I said, we have Mike, a supercluster in his own right, and he set out the breadth of his vision. I'm not going to try and do that now. I will note that he's really focused on attracting the best and brightest people he can. He is a talent builder. He is a community builder. If you look at the disbursement of the funding, you'll see it's relatively even. There's a balance between the scale of discovery research and the strategic investments. You'll also see scholarships and the important role they play. There's another program I didn't mention, which is just Canada Research Chairs. We spend a lot of time on focusing resources on research chairs. Why? Because it anchors them. It attracts them to Canada and anchors them. So these people have highly prestigious chairs, the Canada Research Chairs, the green in the graph. There are 39 Canada Research Chairs in quantum research. We had a question earlier about government. What is government doing? And in the course of the discussion, some questions came up about KeySat and QStack. Some of my colleagues from Canada are here, are actually in a way better place than I am in that they are driving this more directly, perhaps, than us. The Canadian Space Agency is directly involved in the quantum encryption and science satellite project, but it takes many hands to build a good quantum project, and that's true here as well. Communications Security Establishment, Defense R&D Canada, our defense R&D arm of our Department of National Defense, as well as my organization, are all involved in that project. QStack, we didn't talk about this morning. QStack is Quantum Security Lab to advance and de-risk quantum technologies. And again, my organization, as well as Communications Security Establishment and the Defense Research and Development Agency, are all involved in this project. Now, when I talk about what government's doing, back to what I said earlier about our paradigm in Canada, universities are involved in these projects. In fact, in the case of KeySat, I think it would be accurate to say Waterloo, in fact, is the lead researcher in that project. Certainly the earlier version, which was based on using one of our airplanes, it was a University of Waterloo researcher who was driving that program. We were just supplying airtime for him. Within departments, to go to the question of what's happening in government in Canada, this is inside the National Research Council, our organization. We have a long interest in this topic. We have Paul Corkum and David Villeneuve, who've been working on attosecond laser pulses for a long time. We have Andy Sakraja, who's been using spintronics as test beds for quantum dots. We've had Ben Zussman using quantum noise amplification to generate true random numbers. And then we have my colleague here today, Alan Steele, who runs our metrology lab, who works very closely with NIST, very closely with NPL, and they are in fact trying to get at the measurement of quantum in order to support a very vital role that the state can play around the setting of standards, et cetera. What's happening in the private sector? Here, it's not as explosive yet as the AI community, but I think that's because it's further back on the curve, not that it's not happening. It's just that the technology, obviously, from the discussion this morning, is not yet as deployable in the way that we're seeing in the AI community. Nonetheless, we have some companies, some of whom are going to talk this afternoon. But I want to call out something on this slide, the supports to grow more early stage firms. In Canada, we spend a lot of time thinking about building ecosystems. I mentioned that we're a funder of 7,000 companies a year on average that we're dealing with, technology startups across the country. That's money and advice, but it's limited advice because we're predominantly a funder. Real advice, hand-holding for creating a startup, creating a business that's going to make money out of advanced technology is difficult. And so you get entities like Communitech, and we're going to hear from Iain Klugman this afternoon, whose sole purpose is creating the environment around these startups in these complex technology areas. We have others, Creative Destruction Lab at University of Toronto. In fact, there's a range across the country. Each of the ecosystems I was showing earlier has inside it funding agencies, not just mine, many others, as well as incubators, accelerators, networks, organizations for peer-to-peer growing your company to scale based on technology. Takes a lot of effort. Also, we begin to see interesting development. This is why I think AI and quantum are different and something new in the Canadian context. I mentioned it's normal. We get to a certain trajectory and then we start to sputter. Quite often we see substantial out-migration of talent. Some of our most famous failures in Canada have resulted in a subsequent out-migration of the most talented people involved in those entities. I'll pick a harmless one that was long ago. Think about the Avro Aero when we were building our first Canadian interceptor fighter. We couldn't bring it financially to ground. It overstretched the capacity at we're talking 1952. What happened afterwards? Mass migration of aerospace engineers to the benefit of NASA and other entities south of the border. And a realization that we had to approach things differently, which would be a long and difficult story. But here, in the case of AI, here in the case of quantum, something different is happening. For AI, multinationals, of course, have been enticing our researchers to the far better weather in California. And they've also been offering more money, perhaps, than I can pay. I've lost a number of my researchers to multinational companies. But also, a new thing's been happening. The multinational labs have been establishing their AI facilities in Canada. And you can basically pick, we could fill a slide with companies that have opened in the past 3 years, 4 years, their AI research group, their global mandate for research in Canada. That's new. And I think it's because the talent pool has matured to a point where they're comfortable saying, I'd rather run my lab here, thank you. I'd rather stay within this ecosystem. And the multinationals are recognizing that ecosystem is deeper, richer, thicker talent pool than they can find somewhere else, sometimes at that price point, sometimes just period. I was in Japan on Thursday. I was at a presentation. Fujitsu was explaining why they've just located their AI world mandate in Canada and also their quantum mandate. And what that signals to you is that something's different. We're not just watching our beloved sons and daughters with degrees in advanced computing and quantum go south of the border. We're also seeing mandates come to Canada because of the talent pool. It's dense. So what does this ecosystem begin to look like? Again, the slide will be available to you. Of course, you can't read it. It's very small print. I apologize for that. But it gives you a sense that there are different communities, different poles of activity across the country. Quebec, Montreal, a lot's going on. I mentioned on AI. Sherbrooke in quantum. Ottawa, big in both. Toronto, big in both. Calgary, Vancouver. So I think we should recognize that there is an array of activity across the country. There are a number of labor pools, and those labor pools are becoming attractive in their own right as a magnet for the location of activity. There's a lot more to do. We have to ensure that this moment in time around quantum plays out like the moment in time for AI is, that it results in a critical mass, that it creates a magnet, that it attracts mandates, and that it creates a basis for collaboration within our ecosystem and with ecosystems outside of Canada. So maybe I'll leave it at that.